Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
Howdy, howdy. I'm very good, thank you.
So, we're recording this early mid-December, and we were interested in doing a review of the year, particularly around what we've picked up that maybe surprised us, what we weren't expecting, that's come out of the podcast. To set this up just slightly, we have spoken to God knows how many, 40 odd.
Nice. Is that right?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Uh-huh.
40 odd academics on the one hand, or people invested in the spiritual investigation of the scientific investigation of spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And those you don't usually speak to 40 of those in a year in the concert.
No, that's right.
What surprised you the most?
Oh man, I want to hear what surprised you first, because this was a topic that you came up with. What surprised you?
A couple of things.
Uh-huh.
The first is there were areas of consensus I wasn't expecting, and there were areas of disagreement I wasn't expecting.
Interesting.
The consensus, and you kind of hear this every time you speak to someone, which goes, we have a default way of doing things, but that default way isn't actually very good, and comes with a lot of stumbling blocks that humans have run into forever and ever. And kind of on consensus, cross-topic, hey, try this thing that unlocks something inside of us that makes the human being experience easier. So
Wow.
That was the consensus, and I was surprised that there was consensus, because that doesn't seem to be an uncontroversial take, but it was the take that sort of everyone who's investigated this comes to.
So give me an example.
So when we spoke to the guys doing psychedelics, there was a lot of, well, look, human beings and our brains, we make assumptions, and neurons that fire together wire together. And I just think, guys, there's something in the psychedelics thing which speaks to something natural about human beings and changes our perspectives for the better. That was the same answer whenever we spoke to anyone who was mindfulness, like specifically mindfulness practices, Buddhist mindfulness practice. It was the same thing. It was, guys, human brains look a certain way, human experiences are a certain way, and there are certain practices you can do to make the whole ship run smoother. And it doesn't seem to matter whether we were talking about the crisis of meaning, I'm talking John Vervaeke, or we were talking psychedelics, or we were talking, pick your favorite. The fundamental premise was always, we are doing something naturally in autopilot. Humans over time have worked out tools that make that experience better. And I was expecting there to be more beef on that point.
Really? Why do you say that? Why did you think there was going to be more pushback on that? Because in a way that seems natural to me. Like you speak to people who are interested in optimizing humans, so you would think there would be a consensus for, there are ways of doing that. Or maybe I'm missing your point.
Well, no, yes and no. So I understand. You talk to people interested in optimizing the human experience. You're not totally confused when people say, hey, there's a way to optimize the human experience.
Right.
But it's a huge claim. And
that you can optimize human experience, or that there are better ways to do it than we've been doing it.
It's a huge claim that there are tools available to human beings that have been available to human beings that radically, because that is the claim we're making ultimately, that can radically change your experience because you're doing something fundamental as opposed to going for a run or a yoga class. There's something about the software, hardware, wetware of the human brain and psychology that means there's fundamental optimizing that can be done. And that was interesting because I came into mindfulness and meditation as more of initially a headspace dude. And it was interesting that even the guys, and I include you in this, who say, whoa, go gently, be careful. This is a powerful tool. Even you, there was no one really was saying, yeah, the jury's out. Even if you were into psychedelics and they were into mindfulness, or they were into, there was real consensus about the fundamental nature of change. So that surprised me.
Yeah, that's cool. You're right. We got to talk to 40 different people who had a view on radically changing what it's like to be a human. I love that. There wasn't very many conversations we had where people were even talking about sort of small, minor tweaks. A lot of times we were having sort of fundamental changing discussions, right? Like you do this or you do that, and you have this huge, profound, substantial change. That being said, just to riff on that, one of the things that I found particularly surprising was how many voices, literally, I think it's basically everybody, well, maybe there'd be a few exceptions, but almost everybody had such a measured, mature, conservative approach to spirituality and practice. I found that surprising. We didn't get very many people saying, just dive in as deep and as hard as you can go. Almost everybody we spoke to said, be careful. These practices are potent. You want to take it progressively and systematically. You want to move sort of slow is smooth, smooth and is fast style. And, from the outside, it can look like that community is actually, well, as a meditation teacher, I sometimes feel like I feel like I'm a little bit alone when I'm talking about moderation. There are great projects like Willoughby Britton's project, and people are talking about trauma sensitive mindfulness. That's all good stuff. I do still feel like it's the smaller voice. It feels like from the outside that's the smaller voice. And yet when we took a sample of 40 people interested in the science of spirituality, almost everybody said, be careful. So maybe that's a mistake to think that that's an edge view. Maybe it is much more pervasive than it sort of looks like from the outside.
You know what though? Those are people whose identity to some degree is in researching this stuff, which means they've made all the mistakes along the way. They're now the mature.
Oh, it's such a good point. They're not just practitioners, they're research practitioners, or they're practitioners who do research. That's true. So they're not just taking things hook, line, and sinker when somebody says something. They're looking at it in a sort of analytical way and coming back with good evidence. That's true. Maybe also the place where the practice is being proposed. The people that they're speaking to are largely maybe in academic situations, university students. So you're not talking, these people aren't primarily teaching to monastics, right? They're teaching to people who have jobs and have relationships and need to pay bills. So maybe you don't want them to have critical breakthrough, breakdown, crisis stuff happen along the way.
Yeah, it's also just worth saying, when you're a teenager, you make every mistake. And
yeah, sure.
Everyone has that night, I think, when they had drunk alcohol 3 times before. And this time it was the more the merrier. And they hadn't worked out there was a limit. And then they had the next day in bed crying and throwing up every 10 minutes. If you're going to be so deep in the research of this stuff, you've made those mistakes with meditation. You've taken it way too seriously in terms of the length of practice, intensity of practice. You've gone to retreats you've thought, oh my God, what have I done? You're just more mature. You've just seen it all. And you've come to a place that's much more hey, well, a little bit this, a little bit that. Go slowly, see what works. And I think it's of who we've spoken to. We've just spoken to people who have made every mistake along the way. By definition, that's what makes them mature.
Yeah, I guess I half agree with that. The one maybe pushback is lots of the researchers we spoke to, I don't know if I got a sense that they had really done deep, profound, long-term practice. Lots did, that's true. But I think we spoke to lots of people who were coming to this from an academic view. You would expect that rather the sort of monastic voices would be more moderate if that was the case, because they really have put in the long-term stuff and seen the kickback. But I felt like this group of people, the research group, were more moderate than I even feel sort of in the monastic communities that I contact and talk with, as if, yeah, maybe it's just part of the zeitgeist to be careful. When I went, I used to rock climb in Amsterdam, and in the Netherlands, you don't have to use an automatic catch when you fall. You don't have to use what's called a gree-gree. So gree-gree automatically, if the person falls, it catches automatically, which you have to use in Canada. In the Netherlands at the time, you could just use a figure 8, which meant if you let go of the rope, they would fall. Except for it's in my opinion a better way to climb to use a figure 8, because if they do fall, you can let out rope to help cushion their fall, so there's not such a heavy jerk. And it also means that you have to pay attention to the climber. So you're not talking to your partner, you're not eating chips, you're not looking around. As soon as you get that added constraint, that added safety constraint, it sort of pushes against itself. But that's very much the sort of tendency here, right? To be overly safe, to be overly cautious. in the terms of meditation, I think it's a really important voice. But now that we're sort of bringing it out loud, I wonder if that's part of the reason why everybody's saying be careful. Not necessarily because it's maximally useful, but because there's a kind of tendency of being oversafe.
Well, I was going to say it's a clever reaction to something that can sell itself if you're not careful as culty, and I have all the answers, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like you can go on YouTube and within 5 minutes find 100 chances, and that's why I think people who take it seriously and they're mature, that they come at it with the other energy. They think, "Oh my god, I don't want to be those guys."
Yeah.
And the truth is, like, I saw there's this guy Alex Hormozy who is he builds businesses, and he has a formula for the value of a product, and it's around how immediate the effect is, how guaranteed it is, etc. So he compared Xanax and meditation. And his wider point wasn't commenting on either. He was just making the point that the point about Xanax is it's really quick. It comes with loads of drawbacks, but it's quick and it's effective for what you want right now. Meditation is not that. Meditation is a long, difficult... Jesus Christ, it's hard. I mean, it's like you have to learn the skill. You have to be cool with failure. And there's maybe this meta game when you're a meditator or a practitioner of any spirituality, which is... patience.
Yeah, this is something maybe I'd like to do in the new year, because we're going to keep recording this show into the foreseeable future. You know what I'd like to do for a run is get in touch with a bunch of neuroenhancement people, because there's a community growing about quickening the effects of meditation. Just now that you've brought up about speed, and I think this is a really cool community, and there's a lot of money moving around in this community as well. You know, people are really interested to see if there's shortcuts along the way. And I've got to say, I've got like a healthy amount of skepticism about whether or not you can quicken the way in that way or not. So it'd be cool to get a little string of them on the show and just compare ideas and see where the research is.
There's a fundamental question at the heart of this. There are some processes it's obvious you can speed up. You can get a business coach and speed up the pace at which you build your business. No one doubts that.
Yeah.
Can you speed up the lessons of the romantic relationships bring over your life? I don't think so. You sort of have to go and do each of them and let them live and die and learn, you know? And I don't know. I've got no idea which camp meditation goes into.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could speed date. You could speed date and learn a lot about like initial impact with people, but that's not the same as becoming like a really good, mature partner. I guess you can quicken the way by having good people around you who are wise and, with a little bit of ardency and practicing well and practicing right. That all seems good, but that was never in debate. This is more like, is there a pill you can take that can cut the corner? Is there a way that you can fiddle around with neural dynamics actively in order to produce meditative states? And is it the case that by getting into those states that you're somehow better?
When you say
that's the question. That's the strange, provocative point is, can we quickly get into certain states or traits in a sort of fast, low jack way that doesn't take all of this experience? And then to what degree is that still beneficial?
What do you mean by a meditative state? Because I can definitely imagine a Ritalin-induced concentration state. I can imagine a relaxed, quote-unquote, Xanax state. But neither of those seem to do it for me when I think about what a meditative state is.
Yeah, it's a super good question. I don't know. I mean, that's why we should get these. I think this is why we should get on a string of people and see what they think. I mean, one thing that's happening is people are starting to think about the jhanas like this. We've had a few guest speakers come on and talk about jhana. So for anybody who's just listening today and you didn't catch those shows, jhana is just, you can think of it as a kind of highly absorbed concentration state. It shows up, jhana is a word that comes from, well, at least is predominantly used today in the Buddhist tradition. But the sort of idea hangs out in a couple of different spiritual traditions, of course. It's where your concentration becomes so profound that you slip into an absorption. So you really have a lot of extra data gets silenced, and you have a very small subset of your experience, and that's all you're experiencing. So you might have an absorbed state where you're not really hearing things or feeling things in the same way or seeing things in the same way. You're just in a highly concentrated state. There's lots of traditions that think going into those states is of benefit, then you'd have to ask, why is it of benefit? And then this research would be, can we tell what the brain is doing when it's in that kind of state? And then what if we could get that brain into that kind of state without all of the practice? And then wouldn't that have the same effects?
And the question is there something inherent about the natural, organic, as it's been done for thousands of years, journey,
right,
that somehow positions that as still good to the degree you think it's good?
Right.
I mean, I can think of lots of examples of, I'm a soccer fan, where players clearly, despite being uber talented and having the ability, they're just not consistent. They just can't be as consistent because they haven't played 38 games week in, week out, playing well, playing badly, good game, bad game. They haven't leveled out their performance. And I wonder whether by creating an artificial or a sped up talent for those states, you don't run into unforeseen consequences. In a football context, that might be inconsistency. In a meditation context, who the hell knows?
Yeah, I completely hear that. My one big worry, and maybe we can bring this up to some pros in this field, is that I think we have a tendency to think that particular states are valuable in and of themselves, and so we aim at the state. So the science aims at understanding the state and then bringing us back to that state. But there's another way of thinking about it, and that is the state as a side effect. The particular concentration state is a side effect of getting the whole mind system to be in a particular kind of shape. So it's the side effect of you becoming the kind of thing where those states occur. In that sense, then you're not really aiming at the state, you're aiming at something else, and the state comes along for the ride. Like, for instance, you can, maybe you could imagine taking a pill that makes you highly concentrated. But actually, the program of learning to be highly concentrated is not just more effort concentrating, right? I mean, you know this. The way that you come to have profound concentration is you come to have the right relationship and right understanding of how your mind works. You start realizing what distractions are all about. You become friends with distraction, so much so that it loses its newsworthiness because now you've learned, well, whatever the mind body is telling me at this moment isn't as important as my systems used to think it was, right? So you have to have a whole change in your relationship to what the mind is, its relationship to you. What about when it hits weird news feeds? Yeah, it turns the volume up on a bunch of danger signals. Is that actually dangerous? As long as you still think that that's actually dangerous, then you don't get really profound concentration because it will keep magnetizing attention away from the object. So you have to learn a lot about what your mind is, what the world is, what kind of signals are meaningful. It's actually that learning that results in profound attention. So there's a good example. The profound attention isn't the most important part there. Profound attention is the side effect of learning about the nature of your own mind and learning about the nature of your experiences. And you can't get that with a pill. That's experience. You actually have to go have those experiences.
And that's got to be dead on. And that's why I, by the way, and I don't know if I've articulated this in full, I'm such a believer after the last year that if you want to have a meditation practice, God, double up with therapy. The reason being, what you've just described as distractions, things being turned up. If you walk around, and I'm talking from experience, probably from the age of 13 to 20, for me, of, things can just fall apart. So we must be hyper aware. I can tell you from experience, that makes meditating harder. Because all of a sudden, you have more to whack-a-mole, you know? If you double up the game, you're just giving yourself less inputs to have to fend off. I think that's such an awesome program.
I agree, man. And that's something else I've learned this last year, speaking to all of these people, because we've had lots of people talk on that on that topic about the sorts of things that you would bring along into a meditation practice. And, dual wielding therapy and meditation, I think, is a really good idea. You can use your meditation practice to learn more about the mind, and then you can take that, you can speak with a good friend or with a therapist or a counselor and help unpack some of those things that you learn. And as you unpack them, the mind gets steadier and deeper, and that lets you start noticing things about yourself that you didn't notice before, and then you can bring that back as topics to your good friend, to your therapist, to your counselor, and I think there's one way you can quicken it. That would be a really wholesome way to quicken the way.
Yeah, speaking of that virtuous circle, I mean, like, I remember Jack Cornfield, I think, wrote something like, I used to host these retreats, and it blew my mind how many, on paper, middle class, trauma free appearing individuals would break down in tears. And one thing I've learned, and this is potentially a tangential point, the amount our decisions, the way we come across, the way we carry ourselves, the way we react to things, are just being run. The show is just being run 2 layers deep by stuff that happened between the age of, I mean, pick 0 and 25, maybe. Meditation has, I mean, it's wild, the extent to which that's true. And then meditation is this nice kind of way of going, mirror.
Yeah, yeah. No wonder it's so upsetting and not very relaxing. If you do it, long enough and deep enough, you know. Of course, it can be used for relaxation. I think that's true. But yeah, I mean, you're really starting to plumb. You're starting to plumb the depths of your own experience and map the topography of your own emotional reactions, and that can never be easy. I don't know. I think maybe I've told this story. I don't know. I think maybe you know this story. I don't know if I've ever told it on our show though, but I was so shocked. One of the big first profound insights I had over my own emotional topography is realizing how angry I used to be and how set up I was to be in a violent interaction when I was in my early 20s. And the big moment, I remember this so clearly. I was at a retreat in Thailand, and I'm sitting at the table, and it's post lunch, and everybody's quiet and serene and lovely. It's at a Thai Wat. And this great big Thai monk walks behind me. And my very first thought that I was just finally I was mindful enough to notice, because I think this was running all the time, even before I noticed it. But I was finally mindful enough to notice that the first thought I had was, wow, that's a big guy. And if that monk tries to attack me here at lunch, what am I going to do about it? Like, how do I take down such a big guy? Like, where would the closest weapon be if I have to defend myself? We're in a Thai monastery. This is a Thai monk. Like, I'm definitely not being attacked. And I just remember being like, oh my God, like, what is that? Who was even having that thought that I have to armor myself up because there's a sort of big guy walking behind me?
But the point is, that's running the show.
Sure
That's
it is.
Out in that man, it's so funny. Like, I remember running away from a Greek retreat. Like, the textbook don't do a retreat like this story. Totally unprepared, burnt out and exhausted, no idea what the meditation was, hadn't built up the hours, chucked in, no instruction, part of the world I didn't know.
It's like the worst possible situation. I don't know why people go to meditation retreats when they're tired. I hear that all the time. People are like, "Oh, I'm exhausted. I really need a retreat." Like, don't do that. It's like Olympic mindfulness training. You want to do it when you're bored and you've gotten you're full and you feel good. Yeah. Sorry. Keep going.
I think I had a pair of boxers and socks that weren't washed, and I was going to buy everything else at the airport. Like, and I had, like, it was one of those where universities just happen. So I have like little folded, broken up pieces of paper in the backpack. The passport's a myth. I'm booking the flights the night before. Anyway, I go run away after it. I think, geez, let's get out after the 15 or 17 hours a day program. Jesus. I take a bus back to Athens, get robbed, and the whole way through, I'm so relieved because for the first time in X number of years, I have a big old cry on the bus. But that cry is corresponding to things that I was sad about without knowing I was sad about, to put it incredibly basically. That we're getting a voice, and then you get hysterical, not because you're more upset, but the hysteria is, oh my God, this is finally getting a chance to come out.
Do you think that was from the couple of days you did at the retreat? Did that
Yeah. It was the ball of anxiety that I was. Some main themes emerged amongst.
Yeah, you don't have enough sleep to keep yourself armored, and then you do a couple 17-hour days, and suddenly it all just bubbles to the surface.
A good friend of mine is in the army, and he used to do sleep deprivation stuff. He's training. And the sleep deprivation is kind of funky, because we haven't spoken to a sleep deprivation person, but the same mechanic of your defenses are up, or your defenses are down, rather, probably apply. I mean, the underlying premise the whole way through here is, underneath the surface, certain perceptions about ourselves and the world, limiting beliefs, and I don't mean that in a motivational YouTube way, just limiting beliefs, and our fears about the world and people and the way things are, run the show. But if you can go to a Greek retreat and freak yourself out for a couple of days. Strongly do not recommend.
Yeah, it's really, there's got to be softer ways than doing it like that. I'm all for this. I'm all for the soft way today.
Well, the soft way is the sustainable way, and
yeah, indeed.
I think this speaks to a general point, by the way, that I've picked up on this year. Anything you're really desperate to rush now, and we get embarrassed about admitting that, but to yourself that you need in 3 months, 6 months, a year, but it's arbitrary. There's it's not coming from a place of fullness. It's coming from a place of grabbiness and deficit. And the interesting thing this year has been how all these conversations have brought that around in various ways.
Yeah, I agree. So you said you had 2 things you were surprised by. That was the first one. Do you have a second one?
Yeah, the second thing was the amount of routes in that people speak to get the same outcome. So
yeah.
Surprise 1 was, wow, this is all the same outcome, Christ. And then the second surprise was, hang on, but we haven't spoken to 2 people with exactly the same prescription.
No, that's right. I remember Ram Dass, who I love, said that he was giving a lecture one time, and he said it was really far out stuff. He's really into sort of no self and God and guru and all the rest. And an elderly woman came up to him after the show and said, "I know exactly what you're talking about. I crochet." And Ram Dass is laughing, saying, like, the game's so far out, she's completely jiving, completely vibing with all of these sort of deep spiritual truths that I'm laying down. And, she was having access to them through her hobby of crocheting, probably through concentration, I imagine, is the point. But it's just cool that you're right. Like, that's one of the things we did see. We saw a lot of different ways where humans are breaking down old, sticky, suboptimal patterns of behavior and starting to install better, more altruistic, more optimal belief sets and emotional sets, and developing new skills and abilities like metacognition, and from lots of different ways. Yeah, you're right.
What's interesting though, and Ram Dass is a good example, because I think of him as kind of like unhelpfully probably on the pedestal. I think of him as a very, very cool dude. He until relatively late in his life, I think, had a sex addiction, and there was a few teachers who have been addicted to various stuff. Alan Watts, I think, was drunk too much and all of this stuff. And it's interesting because it shows where you can't attack this with one stick, right? And it's kind of a useful tool to take people off the pedestal and realize, like, as attractive, if you're built the way I'm built, some of these frameworks are, they're clearly not supposed to be, this is how to be a human in full. There's other things going on that are specific to psychology.
I like that a lot. I was going to add Nisargadatta, the Advaita non-dual teacher from India, smoked like a chimney by all accounts. And there's a nice, like, short little blurb where his students came to him and they're like, Maharaj, you shouldn't smoke so much, it's not good for you. And he says, no, don't worry, and they say, yeah, but you're addicted, aren't you addicted then to cigarettes, and aren't you sort of teaching freedom? And he said, no, I'm not addicted. I'm just smoking. He's like, you're the one who is attached. You're attached to me not smoking. I'm just smoking. I'm just smoking. I'm not attached to smoking. I'm just smoking. You're attached to me not smoking. You're the one with the issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's cute. That's cute, presuming he could put the cigarettes away, as opposed to he's just learned the gift of the gab and he actually, in fact, does need a cigarette right now.
I hear that. But, Ramana Maharishi said something very similar about fasting, which is kind of interesting. Then we'll come back to your point. I've liked this as well, where people used to come far and wide to meet him, and they would want to talk to him about his asceticism, that he would have these sort of long durations of not eating. And they'd say, wow, you're such an amazing faster. You're such an amazing ascetic. Like, can you talk to me about that? And he'd say, no, I don't fast. And they said, well, you haven't eaten in so many days. And he goes, no. He goes, I'm just not eating. Like, I just haven't eaten. I'm not actively doing something. It's not like I'm not making a whole story about fasting where now I'm fasting. Now I'm fasting, or now I'm meditating. I'm not doing anything like that. I just haven't eaten. It's so amazing. There again, you're not attached to the thing at all. It's just the thing that's occurring.
it's weird how cool, like how good it feels, because you yourself will have done something cool in your life, either gone to university or had something go well, and you're weirdly cool about it. Like it's not a thing. Like you're great that it happened, but you're not as excited as the people around you, and you're not as gutted if it went away. And it's a weirdly nice place to be. It's just happening. Yeah, like I guess I'm going to Australia. Like cool, man. Like I don't know why is it that that version of non-attachment feels nice.
Yeah, I like it. I think I like it because I think it shows that you can have, you can be in the kind of shape, and maybe contemplative training can help us get into this shape where we just cool right out. And then actions are more spontaneous and playful. And maybe we can have less restrictions, less conceptual baggage. I like the idea that Nisargadatta like smoked, but didn't feel like he was attached to smoking. It's just like there's just sort of smoking occurring, like don't be so uptight about it. It's just the thing that's happening. I think I don't know. I think it's cool. But I want to go back to your other point for a second, which was this idea about like, not being too monochromatic with your spirituality because it can leave you in sort of cul-de-sacs. That's another great topic we should take up after the new year. Let's get some people on to talk about where it can go, like where the dogma or where like too narrow of a practice can still leave you not mature. Yeah, so like you can wake up but not grow up and clean up in that famous trilogy of things that we need to do. Like you can wake up to the truth of who and what you are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've grown up or that you've cleaned up your bad habits yet. So you can still have bad habits and you can still be a bit of a jerk and still have some fundamental insight about the nature of who you are. I think that's such an important point, and it's such an important story, I think, to keep saying again and again out loud, that just the attainment of self-understanding isn't going to be enough necessarily to make sure that you're a good human being. And especially it doesn't ensure that you're a good human being around other human beings. As we know from all the copious number of spiritual teachers that we see in the world and that we've heard about in the world, especially recently, that have made mistakes or have missed the mark in important ways, especially in the social realm.
It's an interesting point that, because, I was just reflecting as you were speaking there on that same point around how difficult being a human being can be. And I just mean that because
let's just stop there for a second. It's crazy difficult to be a human. Like, that's just a good thing to just have said out loud, right? It's so hard to be a human. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, and it's like bafflingly hard. And it's hard because you're juggling balls and you're trying to stop them falling. But some of your perceptions around what those balls need to look like come from places of total deficit that cause you emotional strain. Every aspect of changing your external life and internal life comes with you hitting walls of your own limitations. It makes total sense to me you can wake up but not clean up or grow up. Little things like getting your finances in order, making sure your relationships have boundaries. I mean, like, you could just do a shopping list of that kind of thing. Each one of which can totally screw up your experience of your day, week, month, year.
Have you read Jack Kornfield's Ecstasy and Then the Laundry? This should be required reading for anybody who's doing a spiritual practice, I think. One of the stories that I love in that is there was I think it was a nunnery, Catholic nunnery, and it was silent for a long time. And it's a real place of spiritual advancement, You would think that these like long-term practitioners are developing in sort of deep and profound ways. And then the edict for silence in their order changed, and suddenly they were allowed to speak. And I think the nunnery dissolved within the 5 years because nobody knew how to talk to each other with skillfulness. They just couldn't get on as soon as they could speak. It just goes to show, you're a really complex thing. That's why life's hard, in part, because you're super complex. And you're a complex thing living in a really complex thing. And that makes a lot of compound complexity. And just because you can clean it up and work it right and wake up in one area doesn't necessarily mean that all the areas are going to be working. So you can do it silent, sure. But can you do it? Can you do it speaking? You can do it in the mountain. I remember this. I used to do. I've been on a number of long retreats. Lived a couple of years in Thailand, a couple of years in India, and I remember coming home thinking, "Oh yeah, that's it. I'm done. That's the end of the project for me. I'm living in just lots of stability, lots of bliss. Profound contentment." And then this is almost a cliche. I come home for a family dinner because I come back from the East and I come home and then I find myself acting like a teenager, like more or less immediately, like, oh, mom, don't tell me what to do. And, I don't like it when they're like that to me. So you can do it in the mountain, but can you do it at your dinner table? Yeah, hard.
Also, the thing is, they're dynamic too. So, like, I've had two experiences, one Sunday morning and one Monday night, with two people I'm very close with, where no one did anything wrong. We just didn't get it right. Like, both times, either I or they made an assumption that internally was totally coherent, a totally fair assumption, that was never spoken out loud, that the other one didn't catch, and it led to low-level, resolved conflicts. But, like, hang on, why isn't this going right? And I think, Jesus, these are people who I speak to daily. Really daily. How is it possible that, oh, well, they're dynamic and I'm dynamic, so an assumption they made based off some information that I wouldn't have interpreted that way, but they did, and vice versa, now leads us going, hang on, why are we missing? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
That, but in every area of your life, with every variable that makes your life worthwhile.
I mean, how do we get out of bed in the morning is the sort of profound question here, because it's so complex. It's so challenging. And yet, like, look at how well people are doing. I mean, lots of people we spoke with are really living what they speak. Pretty amazing thing. Okay, so after New Year's, we're going to talk about neural enhancement technology. I think that's such a good idea. And the difference between waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. That's good. So we've talked a little bit about what's happened in the past. Is there anything else you'd love to see after the new year? Because it's always good to have, I think, 3. We've got 2 now. What would be a third one that you'd love to see?
Yeah,
you have a favorite topic you'd like to see us do a few shows on?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind.
Tell me.
I think I'm interested in what's predictive of people jumping into the spirituality thing and getting something they like out of it.
That's nice.
What psychology are we going in with? What communities are we going in with? Like, if you wanted to run this as an experiment, what would the relevant conditions you would have to adjust for being, because they matter?
Is this like personality type or life condition? Like, is it like enough suffering gets you in the door, or you also want to sort of think about like, are there any particular paths that are more probable to sort of lead to good outcomes?
Yeah, like, I don't think I've ever met a meditator, and I'm probably the worst example of this, who isn't in their own form quite intense. And I think the exercise selects for what I'm calling intensity. But it's interesting, right? Like, what happens? Because to me, that just implies a base level of inquisitiveness plus suffering equals intensity.
Yeah, I hear that.
I'm interested in what's predictive of it. Like, if you had to build a really complicated formula, what variables would we be talking about? Because it doesn't seem to matter whether you're left-handed or right-handed. It sounds obvious, but that doesn't seem to matter. What does matter?
Yeah,
I'd be interested in working, starting to poke at that. What about yourself?
Yeah. I'm sort of split between I'd like to these are topics that I'm always interested in talking about, but I'd love to talk a little bit more about death and sex, death and love and sex maybe. These are such big topics. They're big human condition things, that we all have to go through, but I don't think we give enough time to learn how to do them right. Like, in a way, sex and death are both sort of terrifying events that we don't know what to do with until we show up. And it's such a shame that nobody's talking to us about how to do them well, as part of our sort of natural maturing. And I think lots of spiritual traditions have lots to say on the proper preparation for these uniquely terrifying events. And I'd like to let's get some pros in to talk about that. I mean, we spoke about love a few times already, but I think it's sort of a bottomless topic to be thinking about like, what is love? What can we learn about love and developing heartfulness in terms of the brain, loving kindness in the brain? We haven't anybody come on and talk to us particularly about that. You know, what's going on in the brain when we do compassion or loving kindness or empathic joy or forgiveness. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, death, there's a few things in there. Death is interesting because we're guaranteed it, and we think about it almost never unless we have reason to.
We should get Evan Thompson back on. Evan's doing a lot of work right now on the philosophy and cognitive science of death and dying. He was such a good guest.
Yeah, the interesting thing about death is that culturally it means different things. We approach it differently. Your belief system matters. When it happens matters. Like, you and me and everyone else treats the death of someone who's 15 different to someone who's 115. That's
so grief is close to there, and grief is a transformative experience in the same way as lots of the transformative experiences we've been looking at are, which is maybe why you can have sort of the same outcomes that you find in contemplative exercises just through profound grief, profound sadness, like Eckhart Tolle, you know, profound depression, sort of shook him awake. Pretty interesting stuff.
Have you seen Afterlife? It's a Ricky Gervais widely panned comedy drama sad thing. This guy,
I know what you mean. Mm-hmm.
I like him a lot, and I liked it a lot. His wife dies of cancer, and he is just a walking ball of depression. I mean, he is angry and miserable, but it sort of maps his journey through those emotions. And the point, I guess, is that he comes out the other side slightly different to how he came in. Which is, if that's not the spiritual process, I'm not quite sure what is.
You know, I love that, and I like Ricky Gervais. That's nice. I just read an article yesterday on some of the neuroscience of death, which is kind of interesting. And the study seems to suggest that the brain has lots of override mechanisms to make you ignore the fact that death can be a personal thing. So it looks like parts of the brain that are responsible for self-oriented processing, they just turn off whenever death comes up as a topic. So you can sort of see neural dynamics. I mean, if the study's right, I'd have to look a little bit more into it to see how it goes. But it looks like neurodynamics shift in a certain way so that topic only looks like it's applicable to others, but isn't applicable to you. Pretty interesting, you know?
It doesn't surprise me. I mean, I know not that childbirth is something I've gone through, but apparently you forget how traumatic it is, and it's an evolutionary incentive to go do it again.
Yeah, exactly. So then it would be great. It would be great to have a discussion on, like, because we can't internalize our acknowledgement that one day we're going to die, what potentially adverse effects can that have on long-term well-being? Because lots of contemplative training programs aim at getting that bit of information to finally get into the system. It's something I'm hoping to do in the new year in my own lab, is to look to see what the benefits are of specifically focusing on and reflecting on the nature of suffering, the nature of old age, illness, and death. I've done a little bit of research last year on horror and horror movies and the benefit of safe, scary experiences and the benefits of playing at your edge. I'd like to take that same. Tell me.
How does that land for you? Because you like horror movies about as much as I do, if I remember. Which is not at all.
It's not at all. Well, so that's a good question. So I was like a horror movie aficionado as a young man. I loved the horror genre, especially the zombie horror genre. I just couldn't get enough. I was the guy who Halloween was my anniversary of my first long-term girlfriend, and we went and saw one on our anniversary together on Halloween night, opening night. That was the kind of I loved the horror genre. I thought it was funny. I thought it was cool. I found it extremely attractive. And then when I started really practicing meditation, I learned two things. One, I was attracted to survival zombie scenarios because I was essentially scared all of the time. about how my life was. And those movies and that genre gave me lots of time to play around in a sort of imaginative landscape about what I would do in worst case scenarios. So it was a kind of fallout of the like natural catastrophizing that I was going through under the conscious line.
So you were watching it going, this is awesome because I would go do that thing, and all the meanwhile winning I'm safe points.
Yeah, it was awesome relative to a background feeling of general anxiety that I thought the world wasn't working right.
Right.
So it felt awesome because it was giving me a chance to think through, well, what would I do in a worst case scenario? So that's the one thing I learned. The second thing I learned was that if I watched a horror movie, then the scenes stayed on repeat in my mind for longer than I was comfortable with once I started actually looking. So, for days after watching the new Walking Dead, every time I closed my eyes to practice, I was seeing the jump scare scenes from the movie. And that's actually when I decided, look, I have to either keep being a horror movie fan or I can do meditation, but I can't do both because it's so disturbing for my mind, the content.
Which is totally consistent with the underlying psychology of I'm worried about this happening in real life and other forms, right?
Sure.
So therefore it's sticky. It's going to keep but also weirdly I get a kick out of it while it's happening.
Yeah. So the one thing that we're getting from the research, which I think is pretty interesting, is if you have a personality of being attracted to or neurotically attracted to danger, then feeding yourself more of that evidence isn't necessarily very helpful, right? So you're scared, so you're going out to find data that enforces your belief that you should be scared, then getting that data isn't going to help. But if you're the kind of person who tends to shy away from your edge, who is often ignoring their own emotional reactions, then being in a safe situation where you can play around with anxiety and fear and jump scares, which I think is what horror movies at the theater can do, is actually really super beneficial. It's getting some evidence into your system about what it's like to be anxious. That's the big take home from last year's research that we're going to hopefully look at. I want to bring it over to the Contemplative training research program, but with just horror movies and well-being, the big take home message was, if you can have a safe opportunity to feel scared and you can do that repeatedly, then your own system starts to learn about what it's like to get scared and what it's like to get better. So you get emotional, robust qualities start just self-developing. It's almost like you're inoculizing yourself to small anxieties in a safe situation is so beneficial to us. And I mean, if that sounds weird, just remember that I think everybody's going to agree that if you completely take yourself out of anything that's dangerous, you're probably not going to turn into a very robust kind of person. You have the kind of bubble boy situation there, where if you have no toxins coming in, you have no allergens coming in, then you actually make yourself quite brittle over time. So it's good. It's good for the system to be shook up and for it to learn about what it's like to be shook up and for it to learn about what it does when it's shook up. That's all good stuff.
But if you're already addicted, if you're already kind of expecting that, is the reason that it feels good because it's meeting your expectations? Is that
exactly. That's right. So then, and we've said this, I think we even said it on the show earlier, but it's worth repeating, one of the things you see in PTSD, surprisingly, you'd think that if you got shook up, let's say in battle, in war, if you got shook up when you got home to peacetime and your situation was more established, you wouldn't go out seeking more volatility. You'd think you'd be like, okay, that's enough. I got a good shake, I got a good shock. And even I'm traumatized, I'm working through my trauma. I want to avoid that kind of data. But that's not always what you see. It's personality differences. But lots of times, the way that PTSD expresses itself is by a sort of fascination and an attraction to exactly that kind of data. War movies, war video games, talking about war with your friends. It's like the system is now expecting to be in danger. And so it goes to confirm those expectations in lots of ways.
Which perhaps also speaks to how we tend to replicate the relationships we've been in our childhood.
Yeah, you're trying to get more evidence in, you're trying to get more understanding about why it happened. Yeah. And there again, you have the personality, people experience abuse early on and that can leave them these are broad categories, but of course that can leave them never abusing anything for the rest of their life, or it can lead to them also getting into abuse cycles with others, showing up in the same sort of abuse cycles later on. So that's something interesting for the research also that's going to have to come out in the meditation research too, is personality differences. That's one thing that I was very excited to see from our show for this last year. There's lots of people talking about the more nuanced elements of the research that need to come out. Personality differences is a big one. It would be great to see somebody come up with a sort of personality test that you could take that would help you get a better view over what kinds of practices would be beneficial to you and what wouldn't be.
Listen, I think that's a fascinating place to leave it.
Nice.
Because we've reflected on this year and set up the next. But I say the next, we're back next week. So
that's right.
Mark,
so we'll see you next week.
It's been a pleasure as always. Guys, thank you for listening. I hope getting an insight into how we think about the podcast and the types of topics we'd like to see discussed is something that's interesting. And we've just had such a ball this year, and we're looking forward to 2023. So this has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. And as always, we'll see you next week.